Our first reading this morning is Ecclesiastes chapter 9, but actually just verse 11, which reads, "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the skillful, but time and chance happen to them all." And our gospel reading comes from the Gospel of Luke and can be found on page 853 if you would like to read along. It's Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, 'Grant me justice against my opponent.' For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, 'Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming.' And the Lord said, 'Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" This is the word of the Lord.
Would you join me in a word of prayer? Let your good news come to us, Lord, not only in word, but in power, in the Holy Spirit, and with full assurance. Amen. So today I want to ask you, what's your story? Has anyone ever asked you that, maybe on an airplane or a business luncheon or a first date? What's your story? There is a sign in my office at home made out of license plate letters that says, "Tell the story." But which story to tell? What characters do you leave in? What plot twists do you leave out? How do you shape the narrative that is your life? How we tell the story of our life matters, and how we tell the story of our community and our faith matters. We often make up stories about other people too, based on what little we know of them. My parents are young and healthy in their mid-60s and took a vacation this past summer to Utah. On a whitewater rafting ride, they were assigned to share a raft with a young family with 2 parents and 2 elementary school-aged girls. And my parents quickly discovered that they were in the middle of a large-scale family reunion. So every time one of the other rafts full of the cousins of these girls came near, they would whack out their paddles and try to scoop a bunch of water into the raft that my parents and this family were in. And so one of the little girls around age 7 yelled out to her cousins, "Watch out for the children and the elderly." And my parents looked around. There were no elderly in the other raft. There were no elderly in their raft until my dad realized, oh, they were pointing to them, my parents, who hardly see themselves as elderly. This is now a family joke whenever we get pictures on the phone from my parents with my nieces. My brothers and I chime in, "Watch out for the children and the elderly." But the characters in a story all depend on who's telling the story, don't they? Storytelling matters. It is one of the 4 pillars of meaning that psychologist Emily Esfahani-Smith determined in her 5 years of research of interviewing hundreds of people about how they find meaning in life. Her TED Talk and her book are really worth looking at. The Power of Meaning, Finding Fulfillment in a World Obsessed with Happiness. So Smith spent these years interviewing hundreds of people, and the 4 pillars of meaning she found across race, culture, class, nation, and religion were these: belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence. I've already preached on the first two, and today we're going to tackle storytelling, which might at first mention sound a little confusing. What story are you telling yourself about yourself? What does the Bible have to say about our stories? And what does the Jesus story of 2,000 years ago have to do with your story today? In this series, we have been walking through sections of Ecclesiastes, which is this odd little book of poetry right in the middle of the Bible. I couldn't find much in Ecclesiastes to go with this pillar of meaning called story. But verse 9:11 stood out to me. It reads, "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the skillful, but time and chance happen to them all." We know this, don't we? We know that our human stories on this planet are not neatly packaged into formulas of A plus B equals C. We know that sometimes the strongest among us get an early diagnosis of disease. Sometimes the intelligent still struggle to put food on the table. Time and chance happen to us all in this story of life. Which brings us to this strange little story that Jesus tells in the Gospel of Luke. A parable is a short tale that has a spiritual point. And here Jesus tells a parable about a certain judge and a certain woman. Jesus describes this judge who neither feared God nor respected people, but what he lacked in those areas he made up for in self-awareness. Did you catch Jesus' sense of humor here? The judge says, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me." He seems, unlike most villains of most stories, to know that he's kind of a bad guy. And you also have to love Jesus poking fun that the judge says to himself, "I will grant her justice not because I've had a change of character, not because I have listened to her story and changed my mind, not because I have seen some stellar example of better justice, but simply because she keeps wearing me out." Or if you have your glasses on this morning, which I don't, but I believe there's a little footnote on verse 5. Do you see that tiny letter B? Those of you who have a really good eyesight. And if you follow that footnote at the bottom, the translation of the NRSV softens it a little. The actual translation is, "or so that she may not finally come and slap me in the face." Okay, this is really in the Bible. Like he's worried that this widow is going to give him a serious black eye. She is a fierce woman to be reckoned with. Now, is this a story simply showing that the squeaky wheel gets the oil? Is this a parable to teach us about this reluctant, tired-out deity that we have to wear down with our pleas for help? One of the reasons that we as people struggle with prayer, I believe, is that we struggle with our image of God. If we view God as annoyed and judging and withholding, why would we want to pray to him? If we view God as chronically critical and disappointed in us, why would we want to talk to her? Jesus, I think, knew that some of his disciples would have had a harsh and judging view of God. Each one of them, like each one of us, would surely have had times they prayed for things that didn't happen. What's the story you tell when your swiftness and skill and intelligence don't seem to pay off? When your strength fails and your wisdom comes up short? What's the story you tell when time and chance happen in the course of your life? What Smith and her team of researchers found from people who expressed a high degree of meaning in life is that they found a way to tell even the most painful events of their life as a redemptive story. By redemptive story, they focused on the good that sustains them, focusing on growth and discovery and hope. Smith describes a promising young athlete named Emeka Nanaka who at 21 years old was one of the star players for the semi-pro football team, the Oklahoma Thunder. But as time and chance happened to him, it only took one game and a hard hit for Emeka to be paralyzed from the neck down. As the weeks and months went by, he began to realize that everything he had defined himself by as a football player, an athlete, a star, a party guy, had vanished overnight. As he sank into increasing anxiety and depression, he said, I've got to figure out a way to weave a better story. And it didn't happen quickly. But Emeka says, before my injury, he described his selfishness and drinking and shallow priorities. My life was purposeless. My injury made me realize I could actually choose to be a better man. He got involved in his church as a volunteer mentor to youth and now speaks widely about the game of life and what really matters. Stories are particularly essential, says Smith, when it comes to our identity. What is the story you are telling about you? And if you're anything like me, that can be a hard one. Is the story you tell about yourself often negative? Stories that say, if only I hadn't blown it that one time, if only that person hadn't wronged me, if only I'd invested smarter, saved more, took that other job, entered into the relationship more wisely, or moved to a better location, fill in the blank. That's what happened to Judas, who for a mere 30 pieces of silver turned in his teacher and his Lord to the authorities to be taken to the cross. He could not live with the degree of shame and regret and found that his life wasn't even worth living, and in a matter of hours, he ended it all. He didn't stay alive long enough to hear a better story. When one of our former Coming Home participants, Julio Medina, preached from this pulpit, he spoke for many of his fellow formerly incarcerated persons when he said, "Don't judge us by the worst moment we ever had." Peter's story could have gone the same way as Judas. On the day of Christ's crucifixion, Peter claimed to passersby who recognized him, "I never knew the man." And it was only when he heard the rooster crow for the third time that we're told he turned from the fire and wept. This so easily could have been the defining moment of Peter's life, the thing that shaped his identity. But Peter had a different story. See, unlike Judas, Peter stuck around and stayed alive long enough to smell that grilling trout on the beach and to catch that glint in Jesus' eye. Jesus, after the resurrection, who never once mentioned the denial, he only wanted to come find Peter and ask him, "Hey, do you still love me? Go love my people. Go take care of my sheep." What would it look like to rewrite one of your stories that you have about yourself, a story of disappointment or regret or shame, or maybe a story of perpetually unresolved victimhood that you have endured? A redemptive story is not a story that makes light of your pain. It just tells a bigger story. What has saved me in my moments of pain more than anything else is the fact that somewhere deep inside, I believe my story is subsumed in the bigger story of God's love for me in Jesus Christ. That is why I'm even up here, even though it terrifies me every single time I preach. I don't think I'm telling you things about me. I'm telling you about a Savior who is love. What do I mean by that? I mean that Jesus himself had a pretty unimpressive story on the surface of things. He was born in relative obscurity in a small town in ancient Palestine. He was born to unwed parents, and for the first 30 years of his life, we're told almost nothing. His public ministry lasted all of 3 years and ended in a criminal's death and a tomb where they could not find the body. And yet, some 2,000 years later, we are still telling this story, a redemptive story, a resurrection story. Jesus' preferred mode of teaching was storytelling, and in this story we read today, it is a contrast parable. It is a parable shown to us of how God is different from human beings, of how while the judge is unjust, God is all fair and wise, of how humans are reluctant to advocate for others on behalf of fairness and justice, but God is rushing to act on our behalf. And the great thing about some of the parables is that every now and then Jesus tells you right at the beginning what this one is about. So if your Bible is still open, note verse 1. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. That's the story here. Don't give up. Keep going back to God, whose compassion you can never exhaust. That's the heart of the Jesus story itself, isn't it? A story of forgiveness that never runs out. A story of hope that never relents. A story of love that never dies. I want to leave you with a few practical takeaways. First, we'll start with Jesus' takeaway here. Pray always and don't lose heart. And as I heard a preacher say recently, just pray what you've got. Pray as you can, not as you can't. You don't have a lot of fancy words and deep theology, pray simple. You don't have hours to go in a meditation room and get close to Christ? Send up a few minutes while you're in the car. You're not sure if you even believe in God or if God's there? Then pray from your place of doubt. You could do worse than to spend a few minutes speaking aloud of things that matter to you. If it helps, write it down. If it helps, find a prayer partner. If it helps, read a psalm, but just pray what you've got. Number 2, speak life and possibility into other people's stories. Jesus was always doing this. He didn't just see a lame man or a blind beggar. He saw someone whose story was full of healing and vitality. He didn't just see a woman of the city who interrupted a dinner party. He saw a woman who broke open her jar and poured it out to prepare her Lord for burial, and he said it was a beautiful thing. He spoke possibility and blessing into people's stories. When I was 24 years old, I felt this passionate calling to go back to Nairobi, Kenya, where I had studied abroad in college. I was going to serve this little non-denominational church called Nairobi Chapel. They had invited me to come and intern with them for a year, and I was going to have to raise $12,000. Now, when I told my parents this plan, my parents who had funded my undergraduate college education, they said, well, that's a lovely idea. Why don't you work for a couple years as a teacher, which was my trade, and then you can save up for a nice African safari. I said, no, that's not what this is. And they said, well, we did not send you to college so that you can ask people for money. So you go ahead and try to fundraise that $12,000, but you are not allowed to ask any of our friends or anyone we're related to. So at that point, I kind of started praying, okay, God, I might be barking up the wrong tree here. But I went ahead and went for it. You know, when you're 24, you don't know any better. And it's great. And so I made up these 85 invitations to a Kenya community fundraiser that I was going to host at the nearby community center because my church wouldn't even let me use a room. They were so suspicious of what I was doing. And I don't know how I found 85 people to give these to. I think I literally begged the mailman and the supermarket worker, but I gave out these 85 invitations. And I planned a huge Kenyan feast. I had a PowerPoint presentation. I had slides. I had costumes. I had artifacts. I had this whole vision put together. And guess how many people came? 11. 11 people came, but one of them was my mom. And I will never forget that she paid very close attention to my presentation and my story and the music that I played and the food that I had cooked. And at the end, she said, this is God's plan for you, and you can send out your letter to whoever you want. That moment, she spoke life into my story. She breathed possibility because she got a glimpse of what God might be doing in my life and in the life of that church in Kenya. Fundraising is no easy task, and we do not have an entire staff of a development team, but we have Jim and we have Fia and we have some phenomenal stewards that are doing this because they love our church. You have an opportunity, we have an opportunity to speak life and blessing into the story of this church. And there are all kinds of stories we could tell. We could tell a story like, gosh, for the last 2 years, we've had a heck of a time. I hope this new minister can get the ship going right. We could tell a story of, well, I'm withholding my pledge to see if I like Matthew Waterstone. Maybe I'll give next year. Let me save you the time. You'll love him. He is great. He is so passionate about ministry, and he is so excited to come and work at this church. But that's not why I turned in my pledge this week. I don't pledge because of who the senior minister is. I pledge because I believe in God's vision and story for this congregation. I believe not only in where we've come, which has been a learning period and a growth period, and God has carried us, but I believe in who we are and in who we're becoming, and I hope that you will too. Speak life into this story. Pray as you can, not as you can't. Psalm 107 says, "Let the redeemed of the Lord tell the story." So in closing, I want to share the story that happened this week to my friends Ben and Gretchen, who are pastors of a Presbyterian church up in Beacon, New York. Gretchen has come here to share about parenting, and they're old friends of mine. And this week, they came to the doors of their church and saw flyers taped up everywhere outside from a white supremacist nationalist group full of anti-Semitic words. As they took down these flyers and posters from the walls of their church, Ben and Gretchen and the elders of their church had a choice about what kind of story they were going to tell. Would they throw away the papers and pretend it never happened? Would they make a complaint to the police and just dig in their heels about how bad this was? Or would they tell a different story? After notifying the police, Ben and Gretchen and the leaders of the church began reaching out to other congregations in the area, synagogues and temples and other churches who had also received these posters. They met with the local rabbi and are gathering people together on November 1st to pray and share a meal and talk about what can be done in Beacon. Here is what Ben writes on new signs that are now hung outside the church walls. "We at First Presbyterian Church will not be intimidated by these flyers, nor deterred in our efforts to build relationships with our neighbors of all backgrounds. Our faith in Jesus Christ compels us to love all people with no exceptions." Ben and Gretchen and their church serve a God who can turn even hate into an opportunity to love. So, church, let me ask you, what's your story? Amen.